The Center for Educational Media and the College of Education at Middle Tennessee State University are proud to offer professional development to K-12 educators in Tennessee through our online video library. These videos are aligned with standards set by the Tennessee Department of Education. For more professional development videos, check out our website at www.mtsu.edu/CEM. We are starting our second session, and this is a topic which has been requested a number of times, and it's the 504. We've had a lot of requests for some sessions on that. And so who better to present it than Dr. April Ebinger from the Tennessee Department of Education on 504. Now this has got a lot of content, and so we're going to have the first part of the session before lunch and part 2 of the same session after lunch. So Dr. Ebinger has been a great supporter of the School Counselors Collaborative, and we are so glad you're here. So I'll leave the rest of your introduction to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Clark. Good morning, everyone. So nice to see so many faces on a summer July morning. You're supposed to be enjoying what's left of your summer vacation. But very excited that you guys are here to learn all about Section 504. I'm sure many of you have heard all of the scary rumors around transitioning to a new platform. So Easy IEP Ed Plan has transitioned over to T-Pulse, and thankfully we advocated pretty heavily with our leadership. So all Section 504 plans moving forward will be able to be housed in that system. So very excited about that. If you haven't used Ed Plan or Easy IEP for 504s before, rest assured, we'll talk a little bit towards the end of what our expectations will be for you. If you have used Easy IEP or Ed Plan for 504 management, the system, again, looks very similar as it has in the past. But we'll talk a little bit about at the end, just to give you guys, to rest your nerves. I've gotten a lot of questions around the T-Pulse, especially with Section 504. So thank you for that introduction. I am April Ebinger. I'm the Director of Psychological and Behavioral Services for the Department of Ed. You're probably wondering, what in the world does that have to do with Section 504? So I think inherited some of this work when I joined the department as somebody who has worked with Section 504 in previous roles. And there really wasn't a designated person at the department who was really covering a lot of the questions around Section 504. So I just kind of absorbed that work. And my colleagues in the Office of General Counsel, Chandrea Hersey, our Assistant General Counsel for Civil Rights, Natalie Perryman, she's one of our staff attorneys. The three of us have really embarked on trying to build out Section 504, provide some more support for Section 504. Part of that will include doing more monthly meetings for Section 504 coordinators at a district level, providing more trainings across the state. In fact, in August, we will be holding 3 virtual trainings. It will echo a lot of this content, so you'll have it way before most of the other stakeholders across the state. However, our attorneys will be present, so really digging into the legality side of things, which we'll talk about today, but especially if there's any questions around civil rights complaints, due processes, grievances, they'll be able to be there to answer those questions for you. So let's get started. I know that you're going to have questions pop up, and that is absolutely fine. Please know if you have a question, just raise your hand and then just wait for that mic to come. And then we'll also be able to designate some time at the end to address any lingering questions that you have as we go through this content. I have tried, as in development of the content, tried to get ahead of some of the questions that we always receive. So those are already embedded within the PowerPoint. Okay? All right, let's get started. Here is our agenda. We're going to go through all the requirements at Section 504. Let me stop there and ask this, because all of you in this room, I'm assuming, are school counselors in some capacity, maybe district leadership or a building level. How many of you are in charge of Section 504 in your district or in your school buildings? Holy moly. How many of you, I always ask this question, how many of you took a class in your graduate school program around Section 504? Everybody go to her university. So what happens, and you guys know this, I, as a school psychologist, worked very closely with my school counselor. Thank goodness. All of my school counselors always kept me on track and on schedule. But you guys walk into a building, some of you from day one, and they say, congratulations, you're the Section 504 coordinator. And most of you say, what's Section 504? So you absorb this work because we give everything that we don't want to do in our school buildings to the school counselors, right? You know this because you guys are yes people, okay? And you're also very well trained to do a lot of different things within your buildings. And we give you this very contentious and legally binding job, and we don't give you any training, okay? So today is all about equipping you to understand from beginning to end, from referral to eligibility to service plan, what your requirements are in your building, and where parents can push back on you and where they can't, okay? So feel free, ask me questions as we go. I know you're gonna have them. All right, this is our strategic plan at the department. Many of you know we just transitioned to a new commissioner of education. But our strategic plan in the state has remained the same. When I think about Section 504, I just gear into academics. What we're talking about with Section 504 is access to general education curriculum, right? For special education, we're talking about giving them the supports and services that they need in order to make reasonable and calculated progress towards their goals. 504 is about access to general education. It's not about more, it's not about less, it's about giving access, okay? So oftentimes I know you have parents come in and they have 75 different diagnoses that they hand to you, right? Give them a 504 plan. I want them to have the gamut of accommodations. The question and the conversation should always be around access as compared to non-disabled peers, okay? So what is it? What is Section 504? It is part of that Rehabilitation Act of 1973. It really is at its core an anti-discrimination law. We cannot discriminate against people with disabilities, and that includes our school-age children. We can't essentially say, you have X disability, and we're not going to accommodate or provide a service in order to give you access to the same environment that we would for non-disabled peers, okay? So it's anti-discrimination law at its core. So when we talk about, and I know that everybody has seen this graphic probably 75 times over in either professional development. I know your districts love to talk about equity versus equality. I know it. This is essentially what 504 whittles down to. We're not leveling the playing field. We are leveling the playing field, essentially. We're not giving more, okay? They're not intended with the 504 plan to do better than non-disabled peers. They're supposed to be given the opportunity to perform in the same fashion. We'll talk a little bit more about this in a moment, but most, if not all, of your students with IEPs are covered under Section 504 and the provisions of Section 504. Most people don't realize that. An IEP is a more narrow version of a 504 plan. So I get questions all the time from parents. I don't want them to have that IEP. I want them to have a 504 plan. It's the same thing, okay? So IEP is a more narrow version of a 504 plan. Again, this is about preventing discrimination and who is required to comply. Those that receive federal funds from the government. I want you to think through that with me though, okay? So when we think about public schools, they receive federal funds, correct? Most of them, right? Private schools, do they receive federal funds? Maybe, if they've applied for any type of federal grants, are they bound by Section 504 rules and regulations? No. They are bound under Americans with Disabilities Education, or not Education Act, ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act, to prevent that level of discrimination from people with disabilities, but they are not bound to the same rules and regulations. Same thing, I know a lot of you as school counselors, where are my secondary school counselors in here? As you guys are talking through and getting students ready to look at post-secondary options, we need to have these hard conversations. Where are you intending to go to school? Is it a public school, a private school, right? What does that mean for you in terms of access and supports that you'll need? Because we know Section 504 does not apply unless they receive federal funds. So, we're going to talk a little bit about the difference between IDEA and Section 504. Because often, as school counselors, how many of you are in charge of your student support team meetings as well? So somebody, teacher, parent has a concern. Not as many as I anticipated. Okay, not as many as I anticipated. Most schools I've worked in, the school counselors also are in charge of that. So a teacher or parent has a concern, and often it rests on the person who's in charge of those support team meetings to know, should it be a 504 referral or should it be an IDEA referral? And it's on you to make that determination. That's a lot of responsibility. Okay? So we want to talk about the difference and why we would make a recommendation for one and not the other. So IDEA requires students to have that qualifying disability. In the state of Tennessee, we have 16 categories that students can be eligible under. Essentially 13 federal plus developmental delay, which is optional for states and LEAs. And then we have intellectual giftedness and functional delay. Those are state-recognized categories, not federally recognized categories. So if they meet that criteria, and then the second prong is, do they have that adverse impact to educational performance, right? Do they require specially designed instruction in order to make reasonable and calculated progress, okay? 504, folks, is much broader, much broader. So in this case, do they have that disability, that mental or physical impairment, okay, regardless of their need for special education, and do they require supports in order to have that access? So I love this graphic because this is what I have to show teachers and parents a lot, because when we talk about all students being in that big circle, right, being in that big circle, and then here are our 504 students. Students with the mental or physical impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities, okay? And then when we keep going inside that circle, this is where we find our students eligible under IDEA, that narrow, broad focus. So my question to you, and what has happened and has come up a lot in the past, I would say 6 to 8 months, there was an Office of Civil Rights complaint out of West Tennessee where a student was eligible under IDEA. The student was no longer meeting criteria to be classified as a student with a disability. They did a non-eligibility, and the parent filed an Office of Civil Rights complaint saying you should have considered a 504 plan. Based on this graphic, watch in reverse. So if I say the student's no longer eligible, that we step out of that little narrow circle in the middle, where are we? We're back in 504 land. The parent in this case did prevail. OCR essentially said the same. If students do not meet criteria under IDEA or are no longer eligible, your teams are bound to consider a 504 plan. Does that mean they automatically get one? No. We love that word in IDEA 504 land, is to consider. How do you consider? You document somewhere in writing that your team considered if it would be appropriate, okay? Doesn't have to be a formal process per se. You don't have to schedule a bunch of meetings unless you just want to have that documented. Up to you, certainly. But you have to consider if a 504 plan is appropriate. I actually got an email this week saying a parent revoked consent for an IEP. Many of you probably know what that means. At any time, they can say, nope, I don't want this. I don't want this. SPED director and the 504 coordinator at the district level reached out because the parent wants a 504 plan. Can the parent make that determination? No. It's the 504 team that comes together to make that determination. However, the parent revokes. Does it automatically mean that we're not going to consider a 504 plan? We're going to consider a 504 plan, okay? So always make sure, once we come out of IDEA land, your teams, and I would really ensure, and I don't know if any district leadership are in here, have some good written policies and procedures to say, anytime we are saying a student is not eligible or they're no longer eligible, we're going to have a process to consider 504. Again, consider doesn't automatically qualify them. Who is covered? I know often what we hear from LEAs and especially parents, well, I brought a medical diagnosis to them and that should suffice. The doctor said he needed a 504 plan. The 3 buckets of who is covered by Section 504 are up here. Has a record of such impairment, okay? Has a record of such impairment. That could include you guys going through that cumulative file and 5 years ago, the parent brought you something and you guys stuck it in the file and nobody ever did anything with it. That could mean that. Has a record of such impairment. Is there any historical information that says that this student has some type of physical or mental impairment? The critical piece here for you guys school counselors is to have a really tight relationship with the person doing your school level enrollment. That's your registrar or bookkeeper, whoever that is, school secretary. Because on those intake forms always it says medical information, medications, any of that. You guys need to be notified if they write something on that. Okay? You need to be notified. Has a physical or mental impairment. So in this case, you have some good documentation that they have that. The parent brings you something, psychological report from an outside psychiatrist, psychologist, they bring you a doctor's note, something, right? You have this in your hands. So now you know they have a physical or mental impairment. They could be covered or probably are covered under Section 504, even if they don't have a 504 plan. Ooh, that's a tricky one, isn't it? The third bucket there is really important for you guys to help your teachers understand. As somebody who's worked in schools for almost 20 years now, 20 years. Being regarded as having such impairment. What does that mean? This is how teachers and principals talk about kids, okay? This is how they talk about kids. Let me give you an example. Historically, I would always walk into the teacher's lounge, which I avoided like the plague, usually. Because as the school psychologist, if I ever sat down to eat a meal, it was, you need to evaluate this kid and this kid and this kid and this kid and this kid. I'm like, I am trying to enjoy my salad. Okay? I don't know if you guys feel the same way as school counselors or not, but I usually avoided it. And also when I would walk in, it always kind of hurt my heart a little bit because I would hear them talking about kids in their classrooms. FERPA be darned, right? And Johnny, he is so ADHD. Susie, man, she has some really bad anxiety. George, man, he is so depressed. What have I possibly just done? I'm regarding them as having an impairment. And teachers, as a previous teacher, I feel like I'm allowed to say this, are very historical for diagnosing students. God love them, right? And I know they come to you too, don't they? They have this new, disability du jour, and they come in and like, I think they have this. We have to teach our teachers to be cautious how we're talking about kids, because if they start that language and if they share that with a parent perhaps, even if the parent doesn't act on it, now they could be regarded as having that impairment, even if there's nothing else that substantiates it, okay? So this is truly something you guys need to flesh out with your building level teams. Do you have teachers that are already accommodating students? I think Johnny has ADHD, so I'm already going to give him a place at the front of the class. I'm going to reduce distractions, right? We're maybe going to test in a quiet space. I'm going to give him some extended time to finish things if he's getting distracted. Maybe that includes doing it during recess, which is a horrible strategy, right? Or missing specials. If teachers are already doing that level of support, you need to know about it. Not that they automatically needs to get a 504, but what are you bound to do? Potentially consider it, okay? So who gets a 504 plan? It's like Oprah, right? You get a 504 plan, you get a 504 plan. And parents think that, don't they? They call me because they're mad at you for not giving their kid a 504 plan automatically. It is not an automatic process. It is similar, if not very much the same, as an IDA procedure. We must evaluate before we determine eligibility. So, any physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. How broad is that? Could that be anything? Potentially. Potentially. So we have to essentially do our due diligence at the school-based level to ensure that we have evaluated appropriately to be able to answer the questions we need to answer, which we're going to talk about. I hear from school counselors a lot, especially after I do this training. And I wasn't trained as a statistician or wasn't trained to deliver assessments. I get that. And that's why you guys have to work as a team within your buildings to find the people who may need to assist you. That may not be you. It could be, in some cases, depending on the mental or physical impairment, it could be the school nurse who's helping you out, right? It could be me as the school psych. It could be the school social worker who's helping you. It could be the admin. It could be the reading specialist. It doesn't all just have to fall on your shoulders, okay? We know that the determination for whether a student has a physical or mental impairment must be made on a case-by-case basis. Again, this is huge. Just because the parents bring in that piece of paper, it doesn't automatically qualify them. We're going to talk a lot about what I would recommend in terms of what your evaluations should include and consider, because those are the pieces that typically are lacking from 504 evaluations. We do a great job of getting the medical diagnosis and that paperwork, and we potentially usually include some teacher input, maybe an observation, and that's usually it. It's in your best interest to do more, okay? Again, remember, all, if not all, students with IEPs would be covered. So typically, and you guys can shout it out if you're like, I don't know if we're allowed to do that or not. Student profile. So if you have a teacher that comes to you and says, okay, Johnny, and by the way, if your name's Johnny, I'm so sorry, that is my kid that I always use, that is the name, that's him. I don't know. There's not a Johnny, it's just him. Says many things that are indicating that they're struggling. This is too hard. I can't do this, right? Struggles to focus on assignments, may not take part in class activities, doesn't participate. What are some mental or physical impairments that would have some of those characteristics? Maybe ADHD? What else? Depression? PTSD? Anything, right? Could cause this. Could it also be because maybe they're struggling with some home life changes? Maybe some normal environmental things are going on in the home and they're just struggling to adjust to whatever's changing. Absolutely, absolutely. Our obligation is to take the information that we're given and to flesh it out. Determine if it truly is that mental or physical impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. What about this one? Absent frequently. Frequent bathroom breaks take longer than normal in the restroom. They linger, so much so that your teacher's like, I'm going to put them on a timer. Leave school early. What are some mental or physical impairments that may have this profile? Anxiety. Diabetes, that's a good one. I heard something else. Bladder issues. I'm sorry? Abuse, absolutely. Any other type of gastrointestinal issues? Certainly. It could be more on the mental health side of things, right? But it also could be on the medical side of things. Our obligation is not to assume that they're just being bad kids, right? And they're just trying to get out of class and escape the boring lecture that the teacher's doing, and to dig into that. Now, as 504 coordinators, your obligation is to evaluate. How would you evaluate? The parents haven't provided you anything. There's no reason to suspect that they have anything, gastrointestinal, urinary, any of that. How would you evaluate to determine if there's a mental or physical impairment? That gets tricky, doesn't it? Who would you go to first? Probably the school nurse, and then the student. Why are you going to the bathroom so often? Do you feel an urge? What does it feel like? Where do you feel it in your body, right? Are they having accidents? The teacher should know that. If they're having accidents, or they're having to leave for a change of clothes. Parents should know what's going on there, and if they don't know, who's coming to pick them up? Okay? Look at this scenario. Fifth grade teacher brings you, the 504 coordinator, a note from the parent requesting a 504 evaluation, because that always happens, doesn't it? Could be on a sticky note, could be on the back of Johnny's folder, homework. Teacher says she forgot about the note and that the parent sent it in 3 days ago. How do you handle this? Yell at the teacher, how dare you forget to give me something? I heard somebody say, contact the parent. Would you schedule a meeting? Probably. Are you required to assess for a 504 every time a parent requests it? Some of you guys have policies, procedures in your district that say yes, because that's the safest route, right? But legally, you're not bound to do that. If you don't suspect a mental or physical impairment, you're not required to assess. You're going to refuse that formally through either meeting notes or prior written notice, whatever you have. You're not required. I don't know about you, but I had parents that every other week they would request new testing. They're like, they've been diagnosed with this, and then now they've been diagnosed with this, and then now they have this. Like, listen, woman, no. We are not going to test your kid every week. It's not in the best interest of your child, okay? And at the end of the day, if you as the LEA don't have suspicion that they have a mental or physical impairment, I'm sure you've heard this too, it only happens in the home. We don't see any signs or symptoms in the school. Students doing great, they have friends, they seem pretty well adjusted, they're doing well academically, no concerns at school, but mom is saying, but once he gets home, right? Very different story. Okay, so be responsive to that. IDA has more requirements around how fast you have to respond, but you are required under Section 504 to respond in a reasonable time frame to parent requests. Somebody tell me what reasonable is. Can mean very different things depending on who you are. Most of the time, reasonable for this context is going to be around 10 calendar days to respond to a parent. So if you know that the parent has sent in that memo 3 days ago and you're just getting it, I would go ahead and call that parent and I would get a meeting scheduled so you could hear concerns, document concerns, and then as the 504 team determine if you're going to assess for a 504 plan or not. Okay? Don't sit on it. Don't just say this is going to go away. I'm going to ignore it, because we're going to talk about the grievance process and due process, and one of those is eligibility, evaluation, identification. Okay? Differences with IDA. I think I already talked a little bit about this, but we're going to get into the real granular differences here. So we all know IDA is federally funded, minus those two categories that are state funded. 504 is that civil rights, broad-based law to protect students and people with disabilities, right? Qualifying disabilities, we have 16 under IDA, and really any mental or physical impairment will qualify if it substantially limits one or more major life activities. We talk a lot about FAPE in IDA, that free and appropriate public education. Is it FAPE, right? In their LRE, that least restrictive environment. Funny though, 504 has a FAPE. Most people don't realize that. 504 also talks about that free and appropriate public education. The definition though is different. When we talk about FAPE, that free and appropriate education for IDA, we're talking about can they make reasonable and calculated progress in the light of their unique circumstances. Let me give you an example of what that means. Would we expect a student with intellectual disability potentially to be on grade level, just like every other fourth grader by the end of the year? Maybe not. Maybe, but maybe not, right? But what are we going to expect? What is appropriate for that student? It's appropriate to make progress based on where they started and what they can do to get them to a different point. Every student is bound under federal law to make progress. Every student, no matter what disability they have. So in light of their unique circumstances, how are they going to make progress? Are we going to have grade level expectations for a kid with specific learning disability? Are we not going to have grade level expectations if we have a kid potentially with multiple disabilities, maybe intellectual disability, autism, and orthopedic impairment? Maybe that's going to be very different, okay? But appropriate for Section 504 is an education comparable, as I mentioned before, to non-disabled peers. Often, again, part of my job is to get all the nasty emails. And parents will reach out and say, well, my child needs read aloud or extended time in order to do well on the SAT and ACT to get into a good college. You guys have never heard that before, have you? I know you have. Is that an educational comparable to non-disabled peers to get them into Yale? No. No. We're talking about education comparable, not doing better, but performing similarly. We're going to talk a little bit, or actually a lot, around extended time and read aloud. I think those, by and large, are the two most requested accommodations. Would you agree? Does every kid need extended time? Does every kid need read aloud? No. No. And what data can you collect to support your proposal to say, nope, we're not going to include read aloud or extended time? We'll talk about that, okay? So again, eligibility of services, we're going to talk about who determines eligibility. One of these must include the parent. The other one does not. Ooh, that's interesting. Accessibility. IDEA does not specifically talk about accessibility, but as I mentioned, IEP is covered by Section 504, and Section 504 talks a lot about accessibility. How can students navigate certain school buildings? How can they navigate different environments? I know when I was still at the district level, I would always talk to all of the building level principals at the beginning of the year and say, do you have any field trips planned? Why do I, as a district leader, want to know if they have field trips planned? We're talking about accessibility now. Do you have a child in a wheelchair and you guys are going on a nature hike that has stumps, and that child's not going to be able to navigate that field trip? Or you're going to a building that is not ADA compliant, it's not accessible, and how is that child going to participate in that experience? It's important for your building level principals to think very much ahead if they're allowing and planning these types of things to ensure accessibility. There's also some rules and regulations around how accessible buildings need to be. I believe if they were built after 1979, there are different requirements for them. Most of our school buildings, I've been to some school buildings in the state of Tennessee that, holy moly, they were straight out of the 30s and 40s. And they're not accessible, but our new buildings should be. That would include extracurricular areas too, football fields, playgrounds. And playgrounds historically, I don't know if you guys have been on a playground recently, they have this little fluffy looking bouncy mulch stuff on it, right? How does one with an orthopedic impairment navigate the playground? Or if they're on crutches, potentially navigate the playground? Very important questions for your teams to be asking in terms of access. Reevaluations. IDEA requires that at minimum we reevaluate a student with a special education disability at least every 3 years. 504 just says periodically. Well, what does that mean? Well, I don't know. What does periodically mean? It could be interpreted very different depending on where you are. Where 504 law is vague and ambiguous, we lean into what IDA requires. So 504 reevaluation should occur at minimum every 3 years, okay? Every 3 years. Or 504 takes it a step further, before a significant change in placement. What does that mean? Change schools, perhaps? Would you consider it to be a significant change in placement if they were going from elementary to middle, middle to high, high to graduation? Potentially. Would a significant change of placement be if the student was remanded to an alternative school? Maybe. Make sure that your district admin, your principals are keeping you posted on what's happening. Often, a student commits some type of behavioral offense, and then they send them somewhere, expel something, and they don't let you know until they're already in that new location. You need to stay on top of that with your building level admin, because we are required to do that reevaluation prior to a significant change of placement. If you time it right, and how I would do it, if you could time it just to be right to do that reevaluation right before they transition from elementary to high, and that naturally hits your 3-year cycle, that would be preferred. More testing is not always better testing, but we also want to make sure that we're hitting what our timelines are. And the goals there are what? Are the accommodations that we have in elementary always applicable in a middle or high school setting? No, not at all. And the reason I say that is the whole environment, the setting has changed significantly. One really easy example is students with a 504 could have a functional behavioral assessment. I was looking at a file recently, a parent filed a complaint. The FBA, the BIP that was in the student's 504 plan that said that they were going to follow, the student was a junior now, was created when they were in 2nd grade. They were bound under this 504 plan to be using a sticker chart. He was 16. It's like, I think somebody needs to come back and reconsider this. Again, that reevaluation, what information, what data do we need to substantiate? One, do they still have that mental or physical impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities? But what do they need for access in that new setting? It's going to look different from elementary to middle to high, especially if they're able to start navigating the building independently. If they have a locker, they have to maintain a schedule and their own materials. All of that changes pretty significantly. Transition. We don't talk about transition in 504, but starting at the age of 14 under IDEA, students are required under federal law to be invited to their own meetings, okay? Because what we want to do is start equipping teenagers to start advocating for themselves. What do you need to be successful? The goal is, as we start to think about those transition services and planning for their post-secondary world, is that they're going to feel empowered to do what the IEP team has been doing all along for themselves. Can mamas come to universities and tell them what to do? They'll try. They'll try, I promise you that. Dr. Wilson in the back could probably attest to a little bit of that. No, the student is now an adult and has to do this on their own. They're 18. So we have to start empowering them at young ages. Does this mean just because we don't require kids to be at their meetings that we shouldn't have them there? I always loved, especially at middle and high school, if the parent was in agreement, having the student attend those meetings. What is working for you? Because historically, always, the teacher says, well, they're not accessing that accommodation. They're not using it. Let's talk to the person who actually either needs the accommodation or doesn't. Is this something that maybe is socially stigmatizing, that you don't want to use this accommodation? Because that's a different conversation. Or do you not really need this accommodation? Get some additional evidence. And I would always recommend having students at whatever age. There could be some that would be appropriate to have. I've had students who have diabetes under a 504 plan, and they're 8 and 9 who come to their meetings. Okay? Independent educational evaluations, these IEEs. So under IDA, you may or may not be aware, I assess a kid. I do a cognitive, achievement, and adaptive test. The parent says, I disagree. Doesn't matter what they disagree with, but they disagree with my findings. At public expense, they can request an IE. They can go out and they can find any practitioner out in the field, and we will have to, as an LEA, pay for them to have this independent educational evaluation. Every single evaluation we do, parents are entitled to this. Thankfully, most parents don't access those, thankfully. However, they do. There's still some that do. Not required under Section 504. If they disagree with your evaluation, we're going to talk about what they can do in terms of filing either a grievance or due process, because evaluation is one of those things that they can disagree with, which is why it's so incredibly important to make sure that your evaluation is comprehensive enough, okay? Parental involvement. Districts are always a little shocked when we talk about this. They are not required participants for 504. They're not. They're not even listed as a team member. Oh, what? They are required participants under IDA. We must give parents adequate opportunity to participate in students' developments of plans, IEPs, evaluations. That is not the same under 504. Are parents required to be a part of some level of the process? Yes, we do need consent from them at 2 periods. Initial consent for the initial evaluation and what we call the initial provision of services, that first service plan. Okay? But they don't have to be a part of any other meeting. Okay? Unless you want them there. And certainly, do parents offer a lot of good, valuable information? Yes. But it's not required, especially if you can't get them on the phone, they're not showing up to meetings, it's not going to prevent you from moving forward. Maybe the 3-year reevaluation's approaching. I can't get the parent on the phone. I can't get the parent on the phone. We're going to go out of compliance. No, you're not. You've done your due diligence. Now you're going to hold the meeting, do the reevaluation as you need to, and update the student's plan. Here's the big difference. I always recommend that school counselors, especially if you're over support team processes, that you have this somewhere to reference during those meetings. And even, because often parents assume, and most physicians, in my opinion, just blanketly say, just get a 504 plan, as opposed to maybe considering IEP. But for your benefit, know what the line is between a 504 and an IEP. And essentially comes down to this definition: specially designed instruction. Are you having to adapt the content, curriculum, or methodology? Content, curriculum, or methodology in delivery of instruction, I believe it is too. Okay? What does that mean, April? So they need specially designed instruction, and now we're talking about adapting, right, the content, delivery of instruction, or the methodology. What is that? Well, if you're in a 504 meeting for an initial referral and the teacher's like, yeah, I'm having to do these types of accommodations, but really I'm having to pull them to my back table after we do a whole group reading lesson. I'm having to reteach that. I'm having to slow the pace. I'm having to use this curriculum instead of the curriculum I'm using for all the other students. Now you're starting to hear, oh, you're doing things that are significantly different than what you're doing for non-disabled peers. Specially designed instruction. Okay? Specially designed instruction. I will say, a lot of our students who are in the tiered process, in Tier 2 or Tier 3, working towards interventions in any type of academics, are we talking about adapting the content, methodology, or delivery of instruction? Probably. Probably. Okay? Not always, but probably. So if you start to hear those buzzwords from teachers, oh, well, I'm having to do this instead of what I'm doing for them, that should clue you in. That should clue you in that we're talking about specially designed instruction. And you may even just want to ask your teachers, are you having to adapt your methodology? Are you having to deviate significantly from your teacher guide? Right? And if so, how? Are you having to do, if you're assigning a text, right? And now, instead of this level of text, they're not going to read Romeo and Juliet, they're going to read this level of this text. Now we're talking about adapting content, methodology, or delivery of instruction. What are your obligations? You have a lot, by the way. You do have child fine obligations, which we're going to talk about. You have the obligation to evaluate. You can't see that, but it says free and appropriate education behind that bright blue color, least restrictive environment, and procedural safeguards. How many of you currently use the Easy IEP Ed Plan system for your 504 management? Ooh, there's going to be a lot of newbies. Yay, you. In our current system, we have the procedural safeguards in there that typically print off every time you create any type of document. It'll be similar in the new system, but procedural safeguards, if you don't have those or you don't know what those are, make sure you also know what they say. Very important. Very important to know what the rights are of parents and then communicate those rights to parents. Often what we see in meetings is they slide the procedural safeguards across the table and say, here are your rights, can you sign this? Parents are required to be informed of what those rights are. A piece of paper could constitute some of that, but if you ever go through an OCR complaint or a grievance process, I guarantee, guess what they're going to ask you without the paper copy? What are the procedural safeguards? What are the parents' rights? And what are the rights? All of these buckets that are above the procedural safeguards. Okay? Your obligation under child fine, their right to an evaluation, their right to inspect records, all of those things, which we'll talk about. Okay. So you are required to reach out and find these students with disabilities. Often for 504, we sit back and we wait for teachers or parents to come to us. It is our obligation, same obligation under IDEA, that we seek out and find these students. How do we do that? Some of you may have referral processes where you are using your screeners, your fall, winter, spring benchmark screeners to find any academic issues. Maybe you guys do have a really strong, robust referral process within your schools that teachers already know what to do when they start to suspect something. Maybe you guys are using other types of universal protocols to identify behaviors or mental health concerns. Whatever that looks like, your obligation is to find them. It is not the parent's obligation to bring them to you on a platter. Okay? Must individually evaluate. We're going to talk a lot about evaluation coming up in a few slides. But again, your obligation is to evaluate before we determine that they're eligible. If you've used the Easy IEP or Ed Plan system, you'll know that in those little boxes where you say what substantially limits, they give you some room to do some justification. That's going to look very similar in the new system. Please don't leave those blank. The justification boxes should be where you're putting your data that you've collected through your evaluation process. Again, an evaluation must occur prior to determining eligibility. Parental consent, as I just mentioned, getting ahead of myself, initial evaluation, and prior to initial provision of services. So the first time you're evaluating, and then the first service plan, parents do need to sign off on. If parents don't sign off on those, please get in contact with your local board attorney to determine how they can proceed. In some cases, districts would prefer to proceed even without parent signature to protect the rights of the student, okay? But typically you are under no obligation to keep going if parents don't provide consent to either of these documents. All right, evaluations. Your evaluation should be comprehensive enough that it is able to answer all three of these questions. These are the three questions that 504 asks us to answer for our evaluation. Does the student have a disability? April, I don't know. The parent didn't bring me any type of diagnosis or outside report, but the teacher's reporting that the student has severe anxiety. How do we assess that? Well, you can get the school social worker involved. You can get the school psych involved. There are assessments that we can administer that will be able to determine if there is the presence of anxiety-like characteristics. We're not going to give you a diagnosis, but we're going to tell you if they have a profile of somebody who has significant anxiety, either in the home or school setting. What are the students' individual educational needs? Questions 2 and 3 are the most often missed during the evaluation process. As I mentioned before, a lot of our 504 coordinators, they rely on that medical diagnosis. They give them that medical diagnosis, great. You get a 504 plan. How do we know what they need educationally because of that medical diagnosis? Does it say that they need extended time or they don't need extended time? Then how do we make that determination if we don't have data to support it? And then does the disability substantially limit one or more major life activities? Again, that medical diagnosis is important, folks. Please don't, it's important. It's a good piece of information. But it is not enough to tell us what the student actually needs in terms of access and educational needs. And then coupled with that, what major life activities that it substantially limits. It's a good starting point. It's not the point. Okay? So you have to think through what additional information are you going to collect? Could that be, in this case, we're going to do some observations? Yeah, that's a great idea. And does it have to just be you doing the observations? No. Get other stakeholders involved. Let them know what we're looking for. That's always really important because historically, if I've ever asked any other colleague to help me do observations, they come back and they're like, well, they participated. I was like, that's helpful. Thank you. We were actually looking for this. Make sure you tell if somebody else is going to observe what you suspect or what they should be looking for. If it is anxiety, do we have any guardrails to know when they are showing anxiety-like symptoms? Is it before a test? Is it before unstructured time where they have to be social with typical peers? Is it when they have to go home? And that's where we're going to gear our observations and then let our observers know when they are given an unannounced quiz or a test, or when they're getting ready to go to playground or to cafeteria. That's where we want to see, do you see any atypical behavior and see any anxiety-like related behaviors? Okay? Individual educational needs. Again, how are we making determinations for what those accommodations or services are going to look like? This is, again, by and large, what most parents complain about are the accommodations. I'm sure if I asked all of you individually, give me an example of a kid who would not do well with extended time and read aloud, you would probably give me a lot of examples, right? So let's talk and let's dig into that. Because by and large, that's what you're asked to put on the 504 plan. Remember, are parents required members? They can provide some input, can't they? But do they get the final say as to what's on that service plan? No. Your evaluation should be strong enough to dictate what should be on that service plan. Okay? So let's talk through. Let's start with extended time. That's probably the one that we see the most. Give me an example or a reason, and if we need to stop and get you a mic, I'm sorry, I haven't been doing that, of when extended time would not be appropriate. Oh, sorry, you have to wait for the mic. I don't want to get in trouble.
If it's a physical disability.
Tell me more.
Well, if it's a physical disability that they broke their arm,
Okay.
it may just need to be adult transcription.
Oh, I like that. So a different accommodation, not what the parent may assume that they need. I like that. So maybe they broke their arm and they can't write, and here comes the writing assessment. Oh no, right? And maybe we need adult transcription instead of extended time. what evidence or what assessment data would you collect, ask to be collected, if the parent was pushing for extended time? What would be really helpful for you guys and your teams to consider?
If they are working really hard during the time and need it.
Okay, I think that's also, we forget that point, don't we? Do they have that level of motivation and desire to finish within this time, or do they know that I'm going to give them time and a half so they take their sweet time to work through that? How much are they completing during that time, right? Somebody over here?
The amount of time it takes them to complete a test.
Yes, yes. Often what we forget when parents are asking for extended time, they automatically assume if they get that extra time and a half, they're going to get 100 on the assessment, right? How are they doing on the assessment already? And what happens if we do give them more time? How much time do they need to finish what we've asked them to do? So a great way for you to do this, you don't even have to do this, school counselors, is come to that general education teacher and say, okay, the next assessment that you're getting ready to give, I want you at your desk to start your phone. When you start the assessment, I want you to tell me how much time it takes Johnny to finish. Okay, and let's say they have 30 minutes to do it. He finishes in 20 minutes and he gets an 85. The average of the class was maybe an 89, okay? Would it be helpful to collect some additional, okay, Susie finished in 26 minutes, George finished in 22 minutes, and get an average of how long it takes? Yeah, because in your meeting, now you're going to say, well, based on Ms. Johnson's data collection, Johnny finished actually quicker than half the class, but scored higher than the majority of his same age peers. Does that sound like really strong data to say, he doesn't need extended time? Uh-huh. How does somebody argue with that? Or on the flip side, what I love, because of course, this is probably more my personality than yours, give him the extended time and see how long it takes him and see if he does better. Are we saying that we're going to have him do better? No, we want to level that playing field comparable to non-disabled peers. So we give him time and a half and we force him to sit there the whole time. Who's going to be really upset with you? Johnny, because he was done probably 45 minutes ago, but no, we're going to sit there and we're going to see how long. I probably wouldn't actually play this out, okay? I think that it's really important for you guys to have some good concrete data. How long are they taking compared to other students? How well are they doing compared to other students? If the issue is in a certain content area, math or ELA or science or social studies, then collect that information there, but then also maybe have your control sample to say, he has a relative strength in math. This is how well he performs when he's timed in math compared to same age peers. It was essentially the same in this other content area. Okay? Now we have some good justification to say extended time is not necessarily appropriate. What are some other, what we call extant data that you already have at your fingertips that you can pull to look at how well a student would do potentially if they're under a time constraint? Grades. I like that you bring that up. We're going to talk a little bit about grades too. I know you guys all potentially are a part of this. We have all of our benchmark assessments that we do. Most often, by and large, we test fluency, don't we? And fluency is a timed measure. Be really helpful to pull those either math fluency probes, reading fluency probes. How do they do under a time constraint? Because if we have parents saying, well, when you put a timer in front of them, they just lose it and they can't do it, right? Well, based on this data, over the last couple of years, they're performing on grade level. Are we expecting them to be above grade level? No, I know parents and their little angels that they want them to go to Yale or Harvard, want them to be above grade level, but we're talking about non-disabled, typical peers, okay? So pull in all that rich data that you have. And if you need additional assessments in that area, who's a great person to go to, especially around processing speed, fluency? Your school psych. We have a ton of assessments that can look at processing speed. And I don't have to give the entire battery, right? If you come to me and you say, April, I need to rule this out. And parent is really concerned about how quickly they can move through tasks. Okay, now I have a lot at my fingertips to say, I don't have to give the entire IQ. I can just talk about processing. A great one of those is we're going to look at a variety of symbols and shapes and how fast they can learn those symbols and shapes and get through the task when I give them something novel. That's a great subtest to give. Loop in your school psychs. And I know some of you are probably thinking, my school psych? We'll say no. School psychs have been trained since this past year that they should be a part of the process. They are allowed to be a part of the 504 process. And in some cases, they should be. They should be. Especially if your school psych is the one who is maybe the quote-unquote expert in that area. We want you to have all the evidence and data that you need to support your position, and if that means going to your school psych, they should be a part of that process, okay? Read aloud. Ooh. Everybody wants to have read aloud until you say that you're going to read aloud. I love being in a classroom for the kids who have to be read aloud, and if you just look at their little faces, they just look so sad. Because most often when we talk about read aloud, we forget that there is a skill that needs to be assessed concurrently. What is that skill if we're going to read aloud to a student? Say it. Listening comp, maybe 2 skills. You've taught me something. Maybe 2 skills. Listening comprehension. Can they listen, understand, manipulate, and push out? And part of that, in my opinion, would be their working memory. Parents often come to you and say they need to be read aloud. And so what happens when you start to read aloud the TCAP science passages? Oof, right? They're long, aren't they? You get all the way to the questions and the kid's like, what are we reading? So what happens is at that moment, the kid then tries to go back and typically reread the passage, and you're now reading the questions. So they're doubly lost. And in this moment, they are just kind of a fish out of water. They can't get through the assessment, and now, especially if they don't have extended time, they're not going to finish this subtest. So it's critical for us to know if read aloud is appropriate, but it's also really critical as we're talking about if read aloud is appropriate, do they have the necessary working memory, listening, comprehension skills to make sure that they're successful with read aloud? How can we assess those areas? Listening comp is kind of easy, right? Maybe a teacher's just going to read aloud a short passage in class and they have to answer some questions afterwards, orally. That would be easy, correct? And the teacher can say, well, based on all of the other students in the classroom, this is how Johnny did when I read aloud this passage. I would probably do a fiction passage and something that was nonfiction in nature, just to make sure I had that comparative analysis there. Some of our benchmark assessments may look at listening, especially if they have characteristics of dyslexia. They may have some additional assessments there that have already been done that you can pull that information, right? You can reach back out to moi, and we can dig into some of those other pieces. How would you assess if they need read aloud? Same thing I just mentioned about listening comp, right? Maybe have your teacher read aloud several passages at varying lengths and see how well that they do compared to their typical peers. If they compare and they are essentially performing similarly to your non-disabled peers, that is not good enough justification to say read aloud would benefit them, okay? We need to have that data. Working memory is always that important one. I always kind of joke about working memory because everybody, I would say by and large, when I have somebody come to me and they stop me in the hallway or something like, oh, Johnny needs to be tested. I'm like, well, what's the problem? Processing. I'm like, well, what does that mean? Right? I don't know if anybody's ever come to you probably and say, they have a processing issue. I see a lot of people shaking their heads, so you guys feel my pain. What does that mean? Right? Can they not maintain information? Can they not learn something new? Can they not work under a time constraint? Can they not manipulate information and push it back out? Can they not understand language? Can they not effectively express themselves? There's so many things around cognitive processing that really people like to whittle down to processing. But working memory, what is working memory? Does anybody know? I'm kind of giving you a psych quiz here. You probably know what it is, maybe not know I'm not going to give you a formal definition, but it's essentially your ability to hold and manipulate information on the short term and determine, are we going to store it in our filing cabinet of long-term information, or are we going to kick it out? How much can students hold in their working memories at a time? I'm not on a TV screen technically. You can talk to me. You can. Feel safe. Feel safe. Any guesses? How many pieces of information can we hold in our working memory? I hear 7. Any other guesses? Who said that? How did I hear that right there? It's like your voice travels. Any other guesses? 7? 3? You probably work with preschoolers, don't you? Thank you. 7. 7 plus or minus 2. So 5 to 9 pieces of information. 5 to 9. How do we know that's true? How have we grounded that in scientific, evidence-based research? How? How many numbers is your zip code? Basic phone number? Ooh. Don't you make this complicated. We won't get into the Miller's chunking theory, but yes, 7, but 10 if you include the national code and the area code. Thank you. 7, how many digits is your social security number? Say it loud. Just kidding. 9. Do we do this kind of haphazardly? It's how much information we can hold at once. Now we're in a classroom with kids, and this is my favorite example, so stick with me for a second. And because I was a previous teacher, I'm allowed to say this. All right, guys, welcome to class today. I want you to open your textbooks to page 72. Wait, no, it's on page 75. I want you to do the odd numbers plus number 18. And when you're done, I want you to take your paper, make sure your name's on it. Don't forget, Johnny, you forgot your name last time. I want you to go put it back in the purple basket, but girls, put it into the pink basket. I want you to grab your folder, I want you to grab your lunchbox, and when you come back to the table, I want you to give me a thumbs up. The kids who have some working memory issues, what are they going to do? Right? What did she say to do? We typically talk at kids and we give them these string of information and we forget their poor little working memories are really not geared to be able to take in that much information. And then if, let's say they didn't eat breakfast that morning, they got in a fight on the bus, they forgot their homework, they forgot their cleats, all these things, does that take up space in their working memories? Yeah. So when we're talking about do they have the skills for read aloud, it's important for us to know how much can they hold and manipulate. An easy little test for you to do on your own, it doesn't even have to be standardized, is something that we do have standardized tests for and some normative data for, is just write them down first or you'll forget, rattle off a random set of numbers. Can they repeat them back to you? 2, 9, 3, 7, 6. Can they repeat them back to you? If you really want to get fancy, 2, 9, 3, 7, 6, tell them to me backwards. How many could do that? 7. I can't do it, and I'm the one who told you the numbers, right? Figure out any assessments or pieces that you need to collect to help support that position, okay? Help support that position. What are the requirements under Section 504? You must include a variety of information and a variety of sources. It can't just be you, and usually it is, because you are the 504 island, you are the queen or king, a few kings, of your 504 island, but it really shouldn't just be you. It should include the teachers. It should include admin. It should include any other person in that building who would have knowledge or expertise in this area. Be validated for specific purposes. This is really important. I would say it has come up a lot recently, I think mostly due to the shortages across the state, is that, you know, we have schools that are bare bones and we just have to utilize our staff in really strategic ways, but we need to remember that if we are administering something that is maybe standardized normative, do they have the credentials to administer it? Is that assessment essentially normed to the population that we think it's normed to? I'll give you this really one fun example. Did anybody keep up with the Johnny Depp Amber Heard trial? Don't lie. You did. I was glued as a psychologist to my TV about that, especially when they had the psychologists testify on either side and talk about the assessments that they used when they were evaluating Amber Heard. If you haven't seen it, watch even just some of those clips. A big piece of the case, essentially, that was missed, in my opinion, and if I was the consulting psychologist on this case, I would have eaten both sides alive, really. But one, on the plaintiff's side of things, on Johnny Depp's side of things, they administered an assessment that was essentially outdated. When tests are renormed, when you have different versions, you have a timeline of how long you could use them. They used an assessment on her that was probably more than 12 years old. Is it valid? No. The defense side of things, on Amber Heard's side of things, when they essentially, the plaintiff said, we're going to evaluate her, so the defendants obviously can rebuttal and have a psychologist come and evaluate herself, and they brought in a psychologist to do that, and they gave her a post-traumatic stress disorder assessment that was normed on military veterans. Nobody got it. Amber Heard, as far as I know, wasn't in the military. Is it a valid score then? And that's how she diagnosed her with PTSD, was from a test that was normed with military veterans. We have to make sure what we're using is relative to the populations that we're assessing, okay? Documented results. Do I require you to write a report? No, you ain't got time to write reports. You have 17 other things to do. You have truancy to worry about, attendance, small groups, everything else, especially if Johnny's losing his mind in the kindergarten classroom. Who do they call? You. Where your results need to be documented are within this new platform. There's going to be boxes that say justification. Put that there. I don't need a dissertation, folks. But you need to have enough evidence there that if the parent files some type of grievance or due process, you have it there, okay? You have it there. Again, all significant factors related to students' learning. This is often what happens, especially on the IEP side of things. I'll be looking at files, and under the IEP, under the medical information, it says ADHD, bipolar, schizophrenia, disruptive mood dysregulation disorder, major depressive disorder, autism, and then their diagnosis is language impairments. It's that whole adage, like in the airport, if you see something, you say something. If you know you've got new information, please include that in your evaluation for that student, okay? Make sure you're considering any significant information that's provided to you, whether it's from parent, the student themselves, or the teachers. Team members get to decide if they have enough information or if they don't. Make sure that your team members feel empowered to do that. Again, multiple pieces of assessment data. Align assessment data to what major life activities are impacted. We're going to talk a little bit, probably after lunch, about what major life activities are and what they're not. But for example, especially for read aloud and extended time, often when we talk about major life activities, we're looking at learning, right? Maybe reading, maybe concentrating, maybe thinking. What assessment data do you need to substantiate that there is a substantial limitation there for those areas? There are no restrictions. I get this question all the time. April, I need to administer a cognitive assessment. I need to administer a traumatic brain injury assessment. I need to administer whatever. Am I allowed to do that? Yes. You are allowed to get permission to administer, even if it's not you that's administering it, any assessment that you need to substantiate this. Okay? There are no restrictions. I think it was a nasty rumor that was out a few years ago that, oh, you can't do this or you can't do that because that's IDA. No. You can do whatever you need to do to collect the information that you need to answer those 3 questions. Okay? So 504 actually discusses this, and I think it's important. When we say a student is eligible under 504, we are calling them a student with a disability. And I hope that none of us in this room take that lightly. It is a big deal, right? It is not just a piece of paper giving them extended time and read aloud. It is saying that the student has a disability that impacts them substantially, and we need to provide additional supports. We need to make sure that our evaluations, again, are comprehensive enough that we're not misclassifying, over-identifying, or incorrectly placing them. And we're going to talk a little bit more about what that means in terms of placing them. Because students under 504, often we assume that they're only in a gen ed classroom. Can they be served in special ed settings? Yes. Yes. Okay? So we need to make sure that whatever we're collecting is going to substantiate any of our determinations around that student. Now, so let's say we're starting at the beginning. We have this referral. We've gotten consent. We know that we're going to look at anxiety, okay, or ADHD. I would say by and large the two areas that we see the most 504 plans, and tell me if you agree or disagree, ADHD and diabetes. Do you agree or disagree with any of those? Or is it more anxiety, dyslexia, depression? You see a lot of anxiety? Everybody else agrees? Okay. I certainly think post-pandemic we have seen a huge increase in anxiety-related issues, disorders with students, right? So anxiety, ADHD, diabetes, right? So we get consent. Let's say we're going to focus on anxiety. What are the necessary pieces that you are going to want to collect? Let's say there is no diagnosis. You don't have a diagnosis. You have to answer those 3 questions. Do they have a mental or physical impairment? Do they have that disability? What are their educational needs? And then how is a major life activity substantially impacted? The referral is for anxiety. Where do you start? I don't know, April. I'm going to call you. I think it's a great piece. Observations. Somebody, whoever referred them for anxiety, is going to be able to tell us when it's occurring, how it's occurring, what it looks like, and then go observe. Should you kind of anecdotally document your observations? Probably. Probably. What else would you want to potentially collect? Remember, we're looking at a variety of sources. Are observations enough? They're not. Maybe getting records requests from a pediatrician to get some records, absolutely. Anything else? A parent questionnaire, I love it. Do a social developmental history. Do they have any type of mental health disorders in their family history? Has the mom noticed some concerns in the past? Do they have siblings who are struggling with similar things, right? Social developmental history, if you don't have a good template for that, email me, I'll give you all that you need. There are some informal checklists that you could potentially do that would just look at some very informal signs and symptoms of anxiety, depression. You could do some more formal rating scales. We have something called the multidimensional anxiety scales for children. They have a self-report too. You can give it to the kid and have them complete this scale. It's 26 questions, takes less than 5 minutes, right? See a hand up.
Last year, we implemented a program called Close Gap. It is a student check-in, and it collects data on the kids. It asks several questions, and as far as social, emotional, different aspects, that we use that a lot to see internalizing behaviors, so.
Perfect. And do they have student-specific goals that they're working towards, or behaviors that you're tracking for each individual child?
Well, the teachers can do it at the start of the day, and they can do it at the end of the day, whenever they want to, but we've tried to use it in morning meetings. It's a free tool.
Okay.
But it gives them specific questions, and they can rate themselves on their energy levels, if they're tired. It just gives a lot of different data, so we've been using that because it's straight from this
What was it called?
closed gap.
Closed gap. I love that.
And it's the student talking about themselves, so
And so the
that's,
student is rating themselves as
Yes.
well? Ooh, I like that.
yeah, it walks them, it walks them through different types of calming exercises if they're anxious and stuff. So we can go back and look at the graph. It does a kind of like a bar graph for us, and we can go back and look at that information
Based
to
on their
determine
self-report?
services for them.
Oh, I love that. That's
It's
an
free, too, so.
incredible piece of information if you have that. And if a student has been involved, I don't know how many of you within your schools have a good, strong RTI-B process. If they've been involved in any type of interventions like that, where you're tracking data, whether it's formal or the student is reporting it, those are great pieces of information to bring to the table, right? Please don't underestimate, and if you've ever been in any of my other school psych trainings, the power of a clinical interview with the kid. If you don't have a tool for that, please email me. My contact information will be at the end. It's a great tool to talk about school in general. Who do you feel safe with? What's hard for you at school? What's easy for you at school? Who are your friends, right? And then you can start to query even more if they say, well, math is really hard. What's hard about it? Well, I just can't keep up with what the teacher's doing. Okay, so what do you feel in your body when you feel like you're falling behind? And now we can start to align maybe what the teachers are seeing and hearing and what the student is saying, all right? I always love going to the student. I think we forget that on the school psych side of things. We get all the information from teachers and parents, right? And nobody ever talks to the kid, ever. We gotta go to the source, especially if they're old enough. And there are some, I love that where they're doing self-report. There are tools similar to that any student, even pre-K students, can mark their how they're feeling that day, their level of agreeableness or their level of energy. I love that. Look at this scenario. Mr. Williams is very concerned. In September, 2 weeks after the new school year began, his 16-year-old son told him that he was having a hard time hearing his teacher, and as a result, he was unable to take notes in class. School promised to evaluate the student, and Mr. Williams consented to that evaluation before the end of September. However, it is now December, and to date, the evaluation has not started, never mind finished. Should the school have completed that evaluation before December? I'm seeing a couple heads shaking yes. So again, do we have a timeline for Section 504 in terms of finishing that initial evaluation? No, it says within a reasonable time frame. What does that mean? Again, where it's vague or ambiguous, we lean into what IDA requires. What does IDA require? 60 calendar days. So you have 60 calendar days. So in this case, yes, you should have completed that evaluation, came back together to determine if the student was eligible under Section 504, and then drafted out that service plan. Again, this is another area where parents are pouncing because we have 3 areas that parents can file due process or grievance: identification, evaluation, or placement. Identification, evaluation, or placement. If you fail to evaluate in a timely manner, they can file due process and a grievance against you. Not you, your district. So make sure you're doing this in a timely manner. You have 60 days from the date you have consent. In our new system, if you've worked with it before, you know that when you enter that initial consent date, it's going to give you a timeline, and it's going to tell you when it's going to be due. It kind of does the hard work for you, which is kind of nice, okay? Here is your 504 team. You'll notice, highly encouraged to include parents, but they're not required team members. 504 coordinator, which is, I'm assuming, you. are required. A principal or LEA designee, which often is sometimes you. That's a good point. Should you serve in dual roles? No. I would be very cautious about being the 504 coordinator and the LEA, because you are essentially presenting evidence to support or refute the decisions that the team is making, and then you essentially could only be one of two people in that room making that determination. I would be cautious about that. In my opinion, I know principals are busy, but I always wanted a principal at my meetings, AP or principal. I very rarely would allow, and he would always ask my school counselors, can you be my principal designee? And those poor counselors have to leave whatever they're doing to come down to my IEP meeting. The LEA is responsible for essentially what accommodations and services the team has agreed on. If the LEA, for whatever reason, says, okay, Johnny, you get a one-on-one in your 504 meeting, and you were there as the LEA, somebody's going to be calling you real hot, okay? So, 504 coordinator, principal LEA, professionals knowledgeable about the student as needed. So who could that be? Teachers, school nurse, school psych, school social worker, could be the band instructor, could be the reading specialist, could be the math coach, could be the cafeteria worker for all that we care, it doesn't matter. Professionals knowledgeable about the student as needed. I would always, always, always recommend have somebody there who is an expert, I'm going to put that in quotes, expert in that disabling condition. Because what happens is we're sitting in meetings and we're talking about ADHD. Parent brings an advocate, because we love that, don't we? Parent brings an advocate. Advocate's like, what is the DSM symptomatology of ADHD? Go. And you're like, inattention? Have somebody there. If that's me as the school psych, if that's the school nurse, if that's the school social worker, make sure you have somebody there. If the disabling condition is diabetes, right? Sickle cell disease, something, have the school nurse there to speak to it. We need to have somebody there that's going to be able to tell us what that disabling condition is and define it, and then talk to us about how and to what extent it impacts their life, right? Because that's going to help us understand the data that we've collected and how we're making a determination of eligibility. Again, it's very highly encouraged to include parents, but you can move forward without them, right? Does the student have a disability? This is the team's obligation to figure this out. Again, the same would apply to a student under IDEA who I evaluated. They had autism, but they didn't require specially designed instruction. They would not at that level rise to need an IEP. The same could be true under Section 504. They have a disability, but maybe it doesn't substantially limit one or more major life activities. And in that case, they would still be protected under Section 504, right? Those anti-discrimination clauses, harassment, bullying, retaliation, which we're going to talk about. But they wouldn't need the plan, okay? I would say that happens rarely, but it does happen. So what is an impairment? Anything. I say that loosely because there is, if you notice, I think I have not an exhaustive list here, but it truly could be anything. I know I was working, when I was working still at the district level as a school psych, we had a student who had leukemia, had cancer. She had a 504 plan, okay? Had students who had IBS, Crohn's disease, had a 504 plan. And many of you are probably like, well, in some of those situations, wouldn't the health plan be enough? Do your schools have individual health plans? Yeah? What do you guys think about individual health plans versus 504 plans? Should you, if they have an individual health plan, consider a 504 plan? Is the individual health plan a legal document? Nope. I'll give you this example. I always kind of loosely say everything's fine until it's not fine. And I love our teachers because they'll sit around a table. There was a small state-run district that was transitioning from one school counselor who had been there for like 40 years to another, and she had no experience with Section 504. So we offered to come out and help model what 504 meetings should look like, help walk her through the forms and what she needed to do. And so we were sitting out there, and this student that we were talking about was, I think, junior, senior, getting ready to go off to college, had already been accepted to college. And she had a gastrointestinal disease that caused her to need to use the bathroom frequently, have a change of clothes with her, spend considerable amounts of time in the bathroom if necessary. She also had access to the faculty restroom as opposed to the student restroom just for social reasons. And I will never forget this. One of the teachers around there was like, I don't understand why we have to do this meeting. This is my planning time. I'm really busy. I'm going to let her go to the bathroom when she wants to go to the bathroom. And most of us would agree that all teachers are good-natured and are going to do that for most of our students until that one teacher doesn't. And then, not the same school, not the same student, not the same context, as a school psychologist in a Middle Tennessee district, was sitting in a meeting for a reevaluation for an IEP, and I could feel some tension happening between the student and one of her teachers. And because I'm a psychologist, I'm going to talk about it. It's like, is there anything that we need to discuss? Long story short, the teacher decided that this student was abusing her privileges to go to the bathroom. So the student, being compliant as she was, requested to use the restroom. The teacher denied, said, no, you're not leaving. We're doing work right now. You're going to sit. You're going to do the work. The student, because, again, compliant, perfectionist, didn't want to get in trouble, defecated on herself. She's in high school. So in this moment, there's a lot of people upset, aren't there? Students upset, the parents are upset, and the teacher was still upset. So we had to do some really honest conversations around what happened and doing essentially some restitution. I will say the teacher still dug her heels in saying, no, she should not have left my class. Now, what we also had to do, this student as a high schooler, goodness, talk about socially stigmatizing. That is going to take a lot of work from all of us to undo. So everything's fine until it's not fine. If that student needs to have unlimited bathroom breaks and unlimited time, it's got to be written into that 504 plan, or teachers don't have to do it. If it's in the individual health plan, the IHP, certainly it's a good starting point, but teachers are not required under law to follow it. So if a student has an IHP and you know that there are some accommodations or services in there that really rise to the level that they need to be considered for 504, please do that. Some of these other mental and psychological disorders that are listed here, most people know what the majority of these are. They typically don't know what organic brain syndrome is, so I always like to talk about that. It is a somewhat outdated term, but it's still listed in 504 law. I don't know why. I know 504 is getting ready to do a massive update with a lot of their rules and regulations, which hopefully they'll change some of the terminology here. But organic brain syndrome is essentially those disabilities that impact memory. So think dementia or Alzheimer's, right? Okay? But so kids with ID or any type of mental illness or specific learning disabilities, they can be protected under Section 504. I would say a big increase that we've had of lately are students with characteristics of dyslexia or who have dyslexia who are served under 504 plans. They may just need extended time or access to certain types of assistive technology, and a 504 plan may be able to provide that to them. Again, regulatory provision does not provide an exhaustive list of what would constitute a physical or mental impairment. So your obligation truly is if the parent comes to you with some truly off-the-wall thing, like they've been diagnosed with right leg limping syndrome. I don't know, that's not a thing. Consider it. Consider it. We know that every iteration of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, we have these new diagnoses that pop up and emerge. The big one now is the one that I referenced before, the DMDD, the Disruptive Mood Dysregulation Disorder. That is a new diagnosis in mental health world, but I'm starting to see it more and more and more on prescription pads or IEPs or 504s. So please don't just pass it off like, I don't know what that is. That's not a thing. Do your due diligence, have a meeting, consider it, and then determine what information you need to collect to do your evaluation if you choose to do that, okay? I'm going to stop right there because I think that this is a good stopping place, and I know that we are getting ready, I think, Dr. Clark, to do lunch. Are there any questions about what we've covered so far before we break for lunch, and then we come back and do the other half of this training? I don't believe that. Now, don't inundate me once we leave this place and like tackle me at the door. Don't do that, because I know you're going to ask a really great question that everybody else wants to know. You got one over here? That always happens. Somebody comes and asks me a question. I'm like, darn it, I wish you asked that in front of the whole group because it would have been a great one. Go ahead.
Okay, so when we were thinking about the read aloud component earlier, oftentimes I think we stick to that has to fall under IDEA. How often do you think it is used? Because, most of the time we look at that reading level and that they have to be 2 grade levels below to get read aloud. So how often do you use that in a 504 plan?
See, great question. And I'm so glad you asked that. So if you guys haven't seen the new updated accommodations modifications manual that the department has pushed out, it's in a live binder. I didn't even know what that was until somebody told me that's where it was. If you don't have that, let me send it to you, because in previous guidance, it said exactly what you just said, that the student had to be 2 grade levels below to even qualify for read aloud. What happened with that was, we just said that there was a cut score required for that accommodation. Accommodations are based on data and evidence made by the team, not based on cut scores. So there is not that 2 grade level requirement. I've also seen that in previous guidance it said that you had to have a certain deficit, like you had to have a deficit in basic reading or deficit in reading fluency. We did away with all that language because of some dispute resolutions where we did not prevail. Every decision that teams make should be grounded in evidence and data and made by the team, okay? Similar to what we've done with the shift in RTI, where there's not a certain number of data points, a certain number of weeks in intervention, there's not a certain cut score to be evaluated under specific learning disability. The same would be true here. Teams should be empowered to know the student best and make the decisions for that student. And read aloud can be offered under Section 504. In that case, though, if you're talking about do they have significant deficits, either cognitively or academically, where they require read aloud, should the team should we do an IDA evaluation? Maybe. I think there's a fine line on some 504s. I've seen 504 plans that I'm like, holy moly, this kid's got everything but the kitchen sink. They need to be evaluated under IDA. And then I've seen others that are very much, no, they have a lot, but they don't need to be evaluated under IDA. So, I think case-by-case basis, but in that case, 504 can be offered under a 504 plan. Follow your district policies and procedures too. I can't say that enough, because some districts may say, no, we're not allowing, which I don't know if I would take that position, but case-by-case basis. Excellent question. See, thank you. You get a gold star. I don't have a gold star, but if I had one, I would give it to you.
So I heard in part of your narrative, you said 504 can be served in a special education setting. Will you elaborate on that? Because
we'll talk about it after lunch.
Okay.
Yes. I'll give you some examples, especially around students who have behavioral disorders, mental illness that may need a smaller setting. Yes. And again, we're talking about access. We'll talk more about that though, but that's a great question.